So my name's Sarah Eager. I'm a trustee of the Janki Foundation, and we're delighted to have you here this evening to share our topic on spiritual care in every encounter. And we'd like to thank the Brahma Kumaris for allowing us to use their venue and for hosting it. And we'd also like to welcome Sister Genti, who's the European Director of the Brahma Kumaris. Welcome, Genti. Could we just ask who's here for the first time? Is there anyone who's new? Few hands? Okay. And did you find out this event through email? Or, yes, someone's nodding head. Through email, website? No, personal contact, friend or family? Yes, so it seems personal contact is the way you find out. Also, just to say, some photographs will be being taken, and if you're unhappy with your photograph being included in any of the reports on this event, please let any of the ushers know, or the photographer, so that you won't be included. So I'm really delighted to be able to introduce Janice Clark as our keynote speaker tonight, or our AGM lecturer. I've met Janice now on several occasions, mainly because of our common interest in spirituality and health. So at the British Association for the Study of Spirituality conferences and other lectures and events we've attended where this topic's been discussed. And she's been studying her PhD on this topic, and it's now become the book which she's drawing a lot of the material tonight from. And I have to say it's an absolutely excellent book, and anyone involved in healthcare, I would strongly recommend that you read it, because Janice is a nurse, a midwife, and a senior lecturer at the Institute of Health and Society at the University of Worcester, UK. And she's also on the board of the British Association of the Study of Spirituality. And this doctorate, she was really exploring the whole issue of nursing and spirituality. And I'm very grateful to the work she's done, because for me I've found it's really brought together some of the issues I've been grappling with myself, in that we try to teach spirituality or teach compassion to healthcare professionals, and it becomes a bit academic, and it sort of becomes a bit something remote from what they're doing every day, and for them it becomes something difficult, and you have to be very skilled in this, or you have to be very confident to have these kind of conversations with people about what's the meaning of their life and things like that. And I think Janice has really grasped a nettle, because she has thought about what do nurses do every day, and what do they do well, and how can we get them to do more of that, and to also appreciate that what they are doing is spiritual care. So I think it's a huge contribution to the whole debate and literature on this field of spirituality and healthcare, and I'm so delighted you could come and talk to us, but really grateful that you've put all your years of experience and thought and knowledge into this book, which we can all now enjoy and take benefit from. So Janice, I'd like to invite you up onto the stage to come and share with us your talk. And so Janice will be speaking to us for about 40-45 minutes, and then her and I will have a little bit of a discussion, and there'll be an opportunity at that point, if you want to ask any questions, to also join in the discussion. So have a little think while you're hearing what she says. Is there anything that I would really like to ask her or discuss with her at the end? But for now, I'll hand over to you. Thanks, Janice.
Thank you. Hello. Is the sound okay? It's getting better? Well, thank you for that fantastic introduction. I hope I can live up to it. And thank you for inviting me here today. I'm really willing to take any opportunity to talk about my favourite subject. So I hope that we can all enjoy this together. The sound seems to have gone a bit. Sound okay?
No.
Is that better? Is that better? Right. Now this is going to be tricky because I have to turn pages over. Okay. Well, let's put glasses on first of all. Okay, I really ought to start by saying that I'm doing something that I've never done before, which is usually I'm in control of all my slides, and tonight I'm not. And there's somebody up there who's doing it all for me. So if you see me waving frantically, you don't have to wave back. It's for Tina's benefit up there. There she is. So between Tina clicking the slides over, me holding the microphone and trying to turn the pages of my talk, it might get a bit messy, but then that's just a reflection of nursing, so that should be okay. When I sat down to write this talk a few weeks ago, after a few stabs, which seemed all a bit inadequate, I did what I usually do when I want to avoid something, and I switch the TV on. But this time I actually did something useful, and I watched a TV programme about John Tavener. I'd recorded it in December. It was a retrospective made shortly after his death. I hadn't watched it because a friend of mine who knew him died at around the same time, and in my mind the two things had become associated, and I thought I just can't face it. But then suddenly I found myself on my own and thought, well, I'll give it a go. I'm sure many of you know the music of John Tavener. Meditative, intense swirls of sound, all deeply spiritual. So there's that word. And I found myself thinking, so that's it, that's what I have to do. How can I find some way of associating what nurses do with this marvellous sound? What can the two possibly have in common? Okay, we're going back to plan A. Right, it's getting better. So what can these two things have in common? And that seemed to be at the heart of this problem to me. The way that spirituality had become incorporated into healthcare, and especially in nursing, had come to me to be something that seemed a little bit sterile, something a bit lifeless. How could talk of spiritual needs, spiritual assessment, spiritual care planning lead us to a place where the work of nurses and the work of John Tavener met? At the end of the programme, the composer John Rutter said, one of the things that we're all hardwired to want is something spiritual. And I thought, there it is again. But what has this to do with healthcare? Well, it was around 40 years ago that healthcare in nursing, in particular, adopted the idea of spirituality and converted it into spiritual care. The word had come into general usage from really only being known in the world of spirituality. It was a way to describe the beliefs inherent in religions. It expressed the personal and experiential side of theology, and it wasn't really of much interest to anybody else. According to the theologian Andrew Louth, theology is thought about God, and spirituality the movement of the heart towards God. And each needs the other. Theology needs spirituality to keep it in touch with the mystery and the experience of God. And to theologians, spirituality without theology becomes, in the words of McIntosh, rootless, loses touch with communal reference points, and easily falls prey to domination by individual fears, desires, and neuroses. But here in this day and age, we have to deal with a spirituality completely detached from theology. And we have to deal with it on its own terms, or rather on the terms that the great swathe of society to whom it seems to be important wishes to deal with it. So nursing as a public service came across this gem, and dusting off the theological debris that clung to it, thought, now what do we do with this? How can we incorporate this thing that seems important to people into what we do? But what we didn't ask was how we can make something useful of it. There we are, it might be working. It wasn't difficult for nurses to find an easy comparison with many of the other things that nurses had already been doing. There was a thing called psychosocial care that nurses like myself were taught in the 70s, and that would really perhaps be indistinguishable from the kind of spiritual care that nurses are often taught today. But it needed to be brought up to date, so it was neatly inserted into a thing called the nursing process. Those of you who are not nurses might not know what this is. It's the problem-solving approach, familiar to any nurse that's trained in the last 40 years. And what happened was immediately this problematized the issue, converted the person into an object with needs, problems that had to be solved, goals and outcomes that had to be achieved. Now, alongside this development, something else was happening. You could call this the cult of the individual, that brought with it an intense interest in self-development, the need or the right for self-fulfillment, intense interest in the idea of the individual having need. So both these movements seem to coalesce into the way that the nursing profession decided to insert spirituality into nursing practice. It was about the individual has needs, they come to the fore at certain times of illness or crisis. And clearly the nurse's role was to identify those needs by assessment and to find a way to meet those needs. And the way that nurses are taught to do it is by how they talk to patients, by having conversations. So this is a mechanistic, rational, problem-solving approach which nurses use to identify problems. The other issue that was important to the way nurses put spirituality into nursing was this idea of inclusiveness. Nurses are charged with the care of every person, and if every person has a spiritual dimension, it follows that everyone must have spiritual needs and the potential for spiritual problems, regardless of whether they themselves actually identify this for themselves or not. And it's written into all the codes of practice that nurses practice by that they are required to assess spiritual needs and provide spiritual care. The other way that this is inserted is by this idea of comprehensiveness. And by that I mean it's the way holism has been interpreted. Holistic care being care of the whole person has come to be interpreted as a kind of comprehensiveness, making sure we cover everything. So as well as inclusiveness, as well as making sure that every person is included, we also have to make sure that we care for every part of every person, including any spiritual aspects. Which again is slightly problematic if you're an atheist and you don't see yourself in spiritual terms. But then, many atheists do see themselves in spiritual terms. But how would a person who didn't feel about having their spiritual needs assessed? There's a writer that I have a lot of respect for that I'll be referring to a few times called Van Hooft. And what he says is this: while the phrase whole person is frequently repeated, especially in the literature associated with nurse education, when you ask nurse educators what they mean by it, they will often answer that they mean that a client is not only a body, but something else besides. And that it's the responsibility of the nurse to care for the needs of both aspects of the client. And Van Hooft asks us to consider, what is this if not dualism? So this is the morass that we've been wading through, I think, for about the last 30 out of the last 40 years. So what's wrong with this? Why can't this continue? The nursing process approach is counterintuitive for most nurses. There's been quite a bit of research asking nurses what they think spiritual care is, and that's what I'll be referring to. Nurses usually show high levels of anxiety and fear about the idea of spiritual assessment, or writing down anything as ambiguous as a spiritual need in a care plan. So what tends to happen is the focus is on religious needs because they're much easier to pin down. Or along with religious needs, how somebody wants to be dealt with after their death. So often in the little boxes that are about spirituality, you will find things like cremation or C of E. So the other, as well as the emphasis on religious needs, the other thing that tends to happen is that the psychological needs come to replace what we might think of as spiritual. And then you end up with critics of the whole concept of spiritual care saying to us, well, if we've got religious needs and we've got psychological needs, what's the need for spirituality at all? Where does this fit in? So we have to find some way of identifying exactly what we mean by spiritual care that is different from psychology and that is also different from religion. I think if we are going to have a viable idea that we want to see continue in healthcare. So Wilf McSherry has done quite a lot of research about the kind of things that stop nurses from conducting this kind of spiritual care. Lack of privacy and embarrassment talking about spiritual needs, the emotional demands and the fear that this invokes. The most commonly repeated barrier cited is lack of confidence. Lack of confidence to give spiritual care because they feel poorly educated, they feel inadequate to the subject. Realistically, time and privacy are at a premium. Education is expensive. The situation with those things is not going to change. And then there's the whole idea of seeing a person as a set of problems and thinking about what that actually means in terms of a relationship between a nurse and a patient. I would contend that it leads us away from thinking of somebody as a person. I would say that it's led us into some of the problems that we currently have in nursing, where care is converted into procedures and persons a set of outcomes to be met. The focus on meaning and spirituality is often talked of as a search for meaning. It's difficult for most people to understand. It's difficult for most of us, whether nurses or not, to understand. Who in the best of health can say what the meaning is in what they're doing? Anyone who leads a considered life spends the whole of it searching for meaning. How many nurses in the brief encounters they have today with most patients, or even the ones they spend a lot of time with, can help anyone else with this problem directly, especially the youngest, the most novice and the least experienced, who tend to be the ones doing most of the work? Then doesn't it seem incongruous that a profession that's about nursing in relationships of care should have at its heart an effort to somehow boost the individual based in the individual? Rowan Williams, as you will know, our last Archbishop of Canterbury, has a lot to say about this. And he said that this spirituality of the self, as he calls it, cannot have another's well-being as intrinsic to it, but only as an adjunct. He says, it deals in escape and of avoidance of the reality of the other. Yet nursing is about the other. So shouldn't a spirituality for nursing be about what nurses do in relationship, about what happens between people? One of the main criticisms that nurses will make of spiritual care is they don't have time for it. Then look at the work that nurses do. The hard physical slog, that is the daily work of most nurses. The running between patients, the lifting, turning, washing, feeding. The organisation that it all takes, coordinating the visits, rounds, treatments, clinics and appointments, the endless record keeping and form filling. Nurses have to ask the questions that nobody else wants to think about. Can he get to the toilet? How much pain is he in? How often is he sick? What does it look like? Then look at the way that nurses are advised to give spiritual care. What are they asked to do? They're asked to talk, to deal in words. Difficult for the most highly trained and sensitive of us. But is it only words that can do this kind of work for us? The research into how nurses do spiritual care always tells the same story. No time to talk, too risky to open cans of worms you might not be able to close again. I'm not trained to do it, I don't have the confidence, I don't know what to say, I don't know how to do a spiritual assessment. In fact, what they're trying to do is what chaplains do, what counsellors and psychologists do, what social workers might do. This isn't what nurses do. When I first began to explore this subject, I found that one of the most popular books on spiritual care for nurses, with a foreword by the President of the Royal College of Nursing, was written by a chaplain. Throughout the whole book, there wasn't a single mention of any of the things that nurses actually do. The hard, physical, dirty, embarrassing work of it. The only mention of any physical work was to say that nurses often do the physical manual stuff to avoid talking. But it's the physical manual stuff that is the stuff of nursing. And I would suggest that we're disempowering nurses by exhorting them to do spiritual care in a way that's alien to them. And they simply don't have time for it. Whilst at the same time the effort, the dignity, the selflessness of the work they actually do isn't considered worthy enough to be called spiritual. But then, since anthropologists first began to study human societies, they've noted that work that involved caring for bodies was always ascribed to the lowest status in the group. Women do it, and women's work has never had the status of men's. Over recent years, nurses have very wisely thrown out the word basic, and they call this daily round of bathing, eating and moving people, they now call it essential. A great move. But apparently it's not so essential that there could be anything spiritual about it. But if this is the core of nursing, and if spirituality is also the core of nursing, as we're told, shouldn't these two things somehow coalesce? Then we have this issue. And what I mean by this is that this style of spiritual care has burst upon the nursing scene with the power of a kitten's purr, not with a bang but with a whimper. Anyone not in nursing will know little about it. The average layperson would be surprised to discover that nurses are supposed to assess your spiritual needs every time they come into contact with you. And I've yet to see it inspire or rejuvenate anyone when they discovered that this was an aspect of their role. It's usually accompanied by a sinking feeling and the sort of, oh, no, how on earth do I do that? But this is a subject that should spark a revolution in nursing. And to me, it seems to be a wasted opportunity. Spirituality has come to be seen as something esoteric, and nursing is very practical. So where does that leave us? Nursing needs a revolution. It's never been more challenging. Everybody's criticising us. We're not doing a good enough job. Is it because there's not enough resources, or are people less compassionate? I think it's a bit of both. But when you read books like the one I mentioned earlier and you see how undervalued nurses' work actually is, the body work, it's dirty work, it's women's work, and it's work in all the taboo areas of life. Illness, old age, disability, pain, death, incontinence, loneliness, all the things we don't want to think about. No wonder nurses don't shout from the rooftops about the things they do. I would guess that even if the problems we have today are all to do with a lack of staff, and too much to do. The generation of nurses qualifying now may not have had the role models that educators like me depend on them finding. They've been moving too fast to be observed closely. Or they long ago got so worn out that cutting corners has become the norm. And that's what students see. So anything we add to nursing has got to have the potential to solve this problem. We've clearly been doing something wrong in education because, although you may not realise it, we've been talking about person-centred care and teaching person-centred care for decades. But apparently some people in hospital beds can't get a drink. And then we have broader issues. Society has never been so fragmented. Loneliness is on the increase. People find community on computers more so than in real flesh and blood folk. Addiction, loneliness, alienation. People want and they need care. More than ever, individuals are craving attention to this side of themselves, to be acknowledged, their inner self, their personhood, their individuality. Ironically, it seems as though as nurses are accused of being less caring, people are more aware than ever of what being cared for actually means. They know when they're being treated as a person, and they want that for themselves. The huge number of books around us now about empathy, community, kindness bear testament to that. And I think that nurses can rise to that challenge. Nursing as a profession has all the potential to offer people that feeling of being important, of mattering, of being cared for, dare I say it, of being loved. Because nurses have opportunities and skills not open to other healthcare professionals. So what do we mean by this? Nurses are there when people are at their most vulnerable, naked, exposed, when the self is at its lowest ebb, when humiliation and a distinct lack of dignity seem all that's left. And while other healthcare workers dip in and out of people's lives, nurses can be there at any time of the day and night, perhaps all the time, doing the physical care everybody else runs away from. But they remit to care when all the other professionals leave. Who is there but the nurse? The nurse is there holding the vomit bowl, keeping your hair out of it, keeping you covered so that you don't embarrass yourself, being an advocate on behalf of individuals. All these are part of a nurse's role, and they don't come into the role of the other healthcare professionals to the same degree. So with this unique and distinctive role, is there a way of caring for a parent's spirit that isn't just emulating what the chaplain does? A way that speaks to the particular calling and vocation of the nurse? This is a traditional model of a person that we teach student nurses. We say this is what a person is. They have a body, they have a spirit, they have a mind, and then there's this bit in the middle where they seem to overlap. But nobody talks about the bit where they overlap. But that's the most important bit, because it's through that integration of parts that what we do with people affects them. So, I would suggest that this is a more realistic model. Maguire is a sociologist who said this in the 1990s, that we need a completely different way of looking at what a person is. So if you think of a person in this more dynamic way, you get a much more integrated and realistic picture. A picture that says that we are all of us, spirit, mind and body, interpenetrating and interacting all the time. And this isn't new, of course. The 6th century theologian Maximus the Confessor puts it like this: unable to exist apart, there is always a relation between the body and soul, independent but in union, forming one composite nature. The body never ceases to transmigrate into the soul, and the soul never ceases to transmigrate into the body, thus forming what the Greeks call a perichoresis, to and fro cycle. So doesn't that mean that how I treat your body can affect your mind and your spirit? Doesn't what I do to your spirit affect your mind and your body? We know that. So this opens up a world of possibilities for nursing. And more than that, that kind of integrated model is talked about in almost all religions and cultures as being a reflection of how the world is. The person is a microcosm of the cosmos of the world, which we'll come back to later. So, if we want to think about, well, what is our aim? Where are we going? This is a useful idea of spiritual well-being, I think. And I just want to pick out a few words from it. It is about meaning and purpose. It's about perhaps seeking the supernatural, but more importantly, some meaning which transcends us. And that's what patients tend to want. When they look for meaning, it's very often about something that will help them to get above the situation they're in, see it in perspective, see its boundaries, and understand that it's not everything, it's not all of them, and it's not the whole world. So this idea of being able to transcend the situation is very important. Spirituality synthesizes the whole body, the whole personality, provides an energizing direction and order. It provides an integrative force, and so on. And this is a quotation from Klebs and Jekyll. Now, Klebs and Jekyll are pastoral care authors, classic authors in the world of pastoral care. And I love this quotation, that people need this kind of care in any situation where the sense dominates that all of life is running downhill. That just seems to sum it up to me. And they describe a model in a lot of detail, and there's one aspect of it, sustaining, which I think is relevant to nurses. And it's about this idea of supporting and upholding someone until their own resources can take over. So they give us two useful ways of thinking of the direction that we're going in. So what is this alternative way that can incorporate all these things? Well, it's innately linked to compassion, which I'm going to say something a bit more about later. This is the core of caring, and it's the core of what nurses should be doing. And I think of showing compassion as practical spirituality. It's about spiritual care that's embedded in the relationships nurses have. Because all of nursing is about relationships, so it's embedded in all the things that nurses do. So you could say it's part of the ontology of nursing. It's what nursing is. And in this way of thinking about a person, the body becomes something different. And I think of it as the spiritual body. This is a quotation from Gregory Palamas, who is a Christian theologian, you can see, from the 13th century. And these are ideas that were originally embedded in Christianity, which now has a much different... people think of Christianity now as a religion which is very rejecting of the body, but it wasn't originally like that. Or as William Blake puts it, man has no body distinct from his soul. So in this integrated view of a person, the body is not pushed to the margin with only a glancing relationship with either spirit or mind, but is an essential part of who we are. capable of transmitting spirituality as the spirit or the mind, and what's done to the body affects the spirit. So this makes the kind of physical and personal care that nurses engage with all day long actually capable of transmitting all the good of spiritual care. Bodies are important in nursing. Having your body as an object which other people are observing, measuring and discussing can make you feel fragmented. And when you feel fragmented, it's as if your body and soul are disconnected from each other, as if you are literally in pieces. The self in conflict with the body. Almost all experiences of illness or injury are about feeling not only that bodies are broken, but also that how you feel about your body is broken. People feel let down by their body, and this contributes to feelings of disintegration, which is not only about the body falling apart, but of body and self disintegrating, becoming separated. To long to be well again is to long to be whole again. These are the words that we use. So the spiritual care of working with people with bodies is to dignify the body, and so to aid reintegration. So how? Through touch, care and attention to bodily needs, as though they were as important as anything else. So what of compassion? And again, Van Hooft explains quite well where he thinks compassion fits in. We react to the distress, to the injury of people in a way that we don't react to the distress and injury of things. Grounded in a mutual recognition of each other. And Davies here describes what compassion is. It's different from sympathy because it's about a call to action. And that's exactly what nurses do. We're about noticing and responding and changing situations, not just about being sympathetic. Believing that other people are essential to one's own humanity, and believing that acting for someone else's good is essential to your own spiritual well-being is part of this. This means that compassion can be seen as essential to spiritual relationships, and so to spiritual care. And in fact, McIntosh, again, a theologian, talks about spirituality as being about relationships. And he says it's about the discovery of a true self by seeing yourself in relation to other people, or in relation to a divine entity. We need other people in order to be ourselves. And as the philosopher McMurray says, our human being is our relations to other human beings. And our value lies in the quality of those relationships. Van Hooft uses the term being for others, which he borrows from Sartre, to make the point that a human is only a human by virtue of being interpersonal and culturally constructed. It's interpersonal contact and our response to and influence from others which constructs us and makes us human. And all this construction is only possible through the body. Through the body we touch, feel, move around, we make the world visible, audible, touchable. So caring for our own bodies is caring for ourselves, and caring for other people's bodies is caring for their selves. So what are the tools that we use to turn spirituality into spiritual care? We use presence. And this is what I mean by presence, what Marcel, another philosopher, tells us presence is. An American researcher, Botov, asked patients what the experience of being comforted was like. One of those she asked said, "I felt I was listened to through body contact and body language more so than in mutual conversation. Strange, so often the words are forgotten when a feeling or presence remains of an experience. She was there totally just for me." And through touch, Levin talks about this. A careful touch. And we need to teach student nurses the importance of touch and how to touch carefully, how to provide comfort for its own sake. So what might this care of bodies look like? How do you heal the pain of broken bodies, fragmented personalities if you're a nurse and all you have is your hands and yourself and it's late at night and there are no chaplains around? This is from Dehenazor, who worked at the Paris hospice. And it's in all the things that nurses do when they are required to represent an individual and their pain relief. And it's in all the mundane tasks of nursing. All sorts of things go wrong with eating. This is just two of them. Patients often feel that they're getting a very good deal when they end up in a side ward, but nurses know that when you're in a side ward you get forgotten. And 3 o'clock arrives and you realise that the person in the side ward hasn't had their lunch yet. And this is a quote from Rivaker, who did some research looking at how person-centred care played out in nursing homes in America. So this, I would say, was an example of non-spiritual care, which many people might have experienced. So what I've tried to do is to break down the process of the nurse's work involved in meal times, in eating, in bathing, in moving, and actually think about what spiritual care takes place in those acts. And this is one of the things that's in the book. And so also in moving. Authors have called this like a dance of movement, sensing a person's balance. And again, this is another quote from Dehenazor. Nurses are often fond of saying to patients, just let yourself go floppy. But what you're asking for is for this person to completely relinquish control to that nurse, to give up completely. And in bathing, we tend to see bathing these days, if you look at nursing textbooks, as just a way to remove debris from the body. That's often the way it's described. It's for hygiene. But there's more to it. And this quote on the right from 1903 is from the American Journal of Nursing. And it shows that in that era, nurses had a completely different idea about bathing and the possibilities of bathing and what they were there to do. which I think we've lost. So, everything I'm talking about is from this book, which was inspired by the thought that there was something about the way we were dealing with spiritual care and teaching it that was missing. And I hope in some way I've managed to fill in some of the gaps and join up some of the issues to get the ducks standing in a row. We often talk about the art and the science of nursing in academic nursing. And everyone knows what the science is, but we're all a bit blurry on what the art is. To go back to the film about John Tavener, the presenter in that film said that John Tavener's music left the world inextricably altered. And I would dare to suggest that expert nursing can do the same thing. Thank you. Have I run over very much?
Oh, you're absolutely bang.
Really?
In fact, I think we've even caught up a bit. Thank you very, very much, Janice. I think a lot of us could relate very deeply to what you said. I'm sure we've all had an experience of being unwell or in hospital, and those times when we felt quite vulnerable, and how important the attitude of the person was to make us feel comfortable and safe. Just before I come over and talk to you, I also forgot to say we are online at the moment as well, so there are people out there listening to your talk. And
Yeah, I was trying not to think about that.
I'm not sure how many there are, but I was meant to welcome them, so welcome. You are listening online. I guess one thing we're both very interested in is how you get these things across to the people that you're teaching or trying to inspire to change the way they do things. So I'm really curious about how it comes out in, you're a lecturer, I don't know if you work on the wards, but how are you getting these concepts through to people? How are you getting them to change the way they do things?
I think that just as compassion is part of being a human being, it's there within people, and it just needs to be brought out. And making the connection between compassion and spirituality is something that I think most people grasp. The way I teach this is I usually start off by talking about the current way it's talked about. The spiritual care planning and assessment and so on. We touch on all those subjects. I give students an opportunity to feel what it's like to have someone ask them questions about their spiritual needs. They do some role play. And we look at definitions and all those academic things. And then I stop and I ask them to just consider a situation where somebody has rung the bell in the middle of the night, and they go to the patient's bed and it's 4 o'clock in the morning, and they find that it's wet, and they have to get the patient out of the bed, they have to sit the patient on a commode, they have to deal with this situation. And I ask them to put themselves in the role of the nurse, easing that person out of that bed into the commode in the dark of the night, and just ask them to think and reflect on whether there is anything spiritual happening in that moment. And first of all, they think I'm mad. because they know that it's far too dark and quiet to have conversations. But they do find all the things in it with a little bit of nudging. Once I say to them, how would you look at that person? How would you touch that person? How might they be feeling? How do you think the way that you touch them might affect how they feel about themselves? And it comes to all of them. They do grasp it. And they usually find it quite enlightening because it's not something that they've thought about before.
I mean, I think what you were saying, that people are getting a much better sense of what it feels like to be cared for, or how they want to be cared for. It seems like in the education we have to really put the nurses and the healthcare practitioners into the shoes of that person and think about really what is going on here, if you're vulnerable. And, and I think some of the best learning experiences for me have been when I've been a patient. I had malaria a few years ago, and it was really interesting to watch how a lot of the nurses only came to do something. They only came if they had to take your blood pressure or your temperature or something. But the ones who actually came up and said, how are you? How are you, the person who's experiencing all this? What an impact it made on you. That someone...
And empathy is very important. I mean, empathy is crucial to this way of caring for people. Being able to put yourself in somebody else's shoes. And I think we've all got that ability. But it needs to be brought out. And I would advocate inviting patients into the classroom and asking them to talk about what is it that makes you feel cared for. What are the instances during the time you've been under the auspices of the NHS that you have felt cared for, and what were the things that happened to you that made you feel not cared for, and how does that feeling of being cared for affect you as a person?
That's an excellent idea. I mean, I think service users and patients are being used more, but those particular questions, explicit questions, would be very, very helpful. I'm curious to see if any of you have some questions that you'd like to ask. Has anyone got an issue or something they'd like to raise? This gentleman here.
Hello. Can you hear me? Yeah. Yes.
Say who you are.
My name. Hi. My name is Davud. I'm a trainer from Sweden, actually.
Okay.
Thing is, while I was listening to you, again, I'm sorry, but recall lots of memories from nursing school, which is all the time about what nurses are supposed to do, to give. But what I would like to hear you talk about as well is like, how should we care about ourselves in first step? Where should we be spiritually to start with? Because this is all this you talked about, according to me, is kind of the next step. But I think to be able to even care about this concept that you brought out, one as a nurse need really be spiritually calibrated. So, thank you.
Yes, I think that, you're right. I think we need to pay more attention at the start of nurse training in helping people to get in touch with themselves as a person. What makes them tick? What makes them happy? What makes them unhappy? I think we have to do that work at the beginning so that we can then help them to empathise. And we don't do enough of that, and we especially don't do it where personal body care is concerned. We throw student nurses into situations that they're completely unprepared for. So yes, I wouldn't, I suppose I wouldn't completely go to the place that some people do, where I would overemphasize getting to know your own values and beliefs, because I think that for a lot of those nurses coming into such a practical profession, that's a difficult thing to grasp. But certainly getting in touch with themselves as a person and then seeing what values and beliefs come from that is a very valuable thing, and it is essential for this kind of care.
I think, as you would have heard earlier, the Values in Healthcare project that we had was really trying to address this in some way. So each of the modules was looking in not a too academic or sort of psychological way, but just getting people to think about those questions for themselves first. So the first half of the module, which is about valuing yourself too, or what are my values, why am I doing this profession, how can I remain calm. So it was asking those questions of themselves first, and then how do I then use that in my work. So I think we were trying to answer that question as well, which I think we're all continually on that quest in a way, is you know, how do we make this easier for people, accessible, meaningful, and useful. So I think I know in my own trust they've started providing days where teams can go to learn about resilience. That seems to be the word that people like these days a lot. The idea of how can I make myself stronger, and they're using biofeedback and sort of ways that they can be more aware of what their own bodies are doing when they're stressed. And
but I think, interestingly, some of the research that I've come across seems to show quite the opposite to what we'd often thought was happening, and it's often the nurses that are prepared to get close to people, that are prepared to be emotional, that are less likely to suffer from burnout.
Interesting.
And it's nurses that are trying to keep that stiff upper lip, that are trying to keep the distance, and not be themselves, to present this other persona, that sometimes have more trouble.
That's
and
fascinating.
whilst we always thought that patients and clients wouldn't respect someone that shed a tear in front of them, I think we know now that that's just not the case, and everything that I've read suggests that patients really value and respect someone who's prepared to sit with them and very simply say, this is a bloody awful situation, and I feel terrible for you. And we have tended to overcomplicate those kind of relationships, and nurses will often go away with the idea now that in order to have the simplest human conversation they have to have done a course of counselling skills. And I really think we've done a disservice in that way, and we need to get back to being much more ordinary and human with each other.
I think you're absolutely right. I know for myself, it's sort of like towards the latter part of one's career, you feel you have the confidence to just sort of be yourself, really, and say, you know, I'm going to say this, and you know it's okay. And you don't have a lot of role models like that, really. And I think what you're saying, we do need those role models of people who really can naturally connect with people and show that that's okay.
And we do expect an awful lot of very young, sometimes quite immature nurses, and they are often not in the kind of place in their life where they want to be honest about how they feel about a person the way that I've just described. But we can teach them the importance of making eye contact, of putting a hand on a shoulder, and being empathetic. And very often patients report that in studies that they get that, they know that, they don't need words, but they do know when somebody touches them with real empathy.
There's also, I mean, it can sound quite trite, but I know there are programs now where the healthcare assistants and the nurses are being taught to say, hello, my name is.
Yes.
You know, that even just to say, hello, my name is, if they get that, that's a welcoming but to have to remind people to say
I
that.
know.
But I can understand that because sometimes you're so busy, you're so rushed, you're very preoccupied that you can forget even these very simple kind of human courtesies which make a lot of difference.
Yeah.
Has anyone else got something they would like to ask? Sorry, there's one there and then there's one down the front. Yes.
My name is Awele and I do a lot of work in terms of stress in the workplace with health professionals. I work as an occupational therapist in mental health. And one of the first things I wanted to say was, first of all, agree with you that the NHS is certainly a place where spirituality is really not acknowledged. It's a very non-spiritual working environment, and often, as we know, the patient to staff ratio is really against being able to provide the kind of care you would like to provide. One particular area of that I wanted to bring up was, as a consultant psychiatrist, what is your perspective on the use of medication, mental health medication? As in terms of my observations, it's so dehumanising, and currently I have a particular client in mind that's regularly acuphased. And just seeing how that affects her, and it seems much more a way of the staff being able to manage the client than really about the client's welfare and care for the client. So I just really wanted your opinion on that.
Well, I think as a huge subject, and it's not really the topic of tonight's lecture, and I think we should take advantage of Janice's presence and respect that she's giving the talk. I think it's very difficult to comment on such a general thing. I've seen medication be used very appropriately and helped people enormously, and I've seen medication be overused and inappropriate. So I think it's a huge spectrum, and it's an individual case as to how that's working. But I think relating to Janice's topic, you've talked about in your book you talk about the medicalisation of problems and how I think in general there is a whole issue on big pharma and using medication to tackle everything, which a lot of people feel very uncomfortable about, in the sense of if you're looking at the whole person, that's just one aspect, but it has its use and it has its place. But I think it has to be done in a balanced way. I mean, I'm not sure, do you have any comment about this kind of medicalisation of normal problems and things?
I'm just thinking that there's a whole book there in the spirituality of medication. You know, prescribing within the context of relationships that are empathetic and spiritual is a very interesting subject. But you know, there are the pressures of time, and that's what stymies a lot of that kind of care, because when somebody has very deep mental health problems, talk may be what they need to do, but that's the most time-consuming thing that we can do. I mean, it's the aspect of healthcare that is always pushed to the side. So it's a very difficult problem. But I would say, in terms of medicalisation generally, I think that we have, and certainly in nursing, we have medicalised a lot of ordinary human behaviour. I mean, there is a movement in America to write nursing diagnoses, so that they're called the North American Nursing Diagnosis Association, and they've taken practically everything that nurses do and written it as a diagnosis with a set of symptoms and then some suggestions as to what should go in a care plan. Very mechanistic, and within those nursing diagnoses there is a spiritual distress, a spiritual pain, and that really saddens me, because that is really removing nursing out of being in relationship with people, and that is really objectifying individuals, and so we can go too far down that path.
No, I agree. There was another lady down here, Margaret. Let's ask the question. Microphone's coming.
I actually had a month stay in mental hospital 2 years ago, and I had a named nurse, and to this day I don't know who they were. They never introduced themselves, and the only time I had any contact with the nurses was when they lined us up in the corridor to medicate us. And what I really felt was that there was a big sense of fear in the nursing staff, and they kept away from you. Because of your energy, it's very negative and very destructive. So I would like to know how you would teach spiritual care to nurses who are working in mental institutions.
Well, I think you're right. It is a very big problem. I think there is a lot of fear amongst nurses. Nurses are very fearful of doing the wrong thing. And we've taught them that they can't do very much without having a teaching session on it. So the ordinariness has often been lost. I'm not of the opinion that education, in terms of formal education, is the answer to everything. Apart from anything else, it's just too expensive. We have this big issue in the health service with a thing called backfill, which you might be familiar with, where every time you take a nurse out of the clinical area and you send them on a course or a study day or a workshop, that place has got to be filled in. So the NHS is not just paying for the course, the workshop, the study day, but also for somebody else to take that person's place. And I'm much more in favour of, in workplaces, people learning for themselves, having facilitators and clinical leaders who have some of these ideas in their head, who will spread that amongst their own staff. Using debates, using discussions, using case studies. You need inspired leaders for this sort of work. Sending everybody off on courses is just not going to do it. I think it doesn't do it when you're helping people to learn about helping someone with incontinence. So it certainly isn't going to do it. Talking about spiritual care, there is so much evidence of lots of money being spent on courses that haven't made any difference back at the ranch. So I think it's about taking individuals and inspiring them as leaders and helping them to spread this message amongst their team, and the team being inspired to want to be different, and then to ask questions like, well, why is it that we don't have time for that? Is there a different way we could organise ourselves? Why do we have to put up with this? It's about empowering people to be who they really want to be anyway. So that's how I would say it needs to be done.
I think we've got time for one more or 1.5. If you want to share it. Did you both have a question?
Yes, we did.
Do you want to both say your bits and then we'll respond?
Okay, I'll be quick. I was just thinking on what you've said now. How do we actually count the difference or measure the difference in the way that the North American Nurses Diagnosis Association were trying to do? They were trying to identify what nurses are doing, because the whole system is based on being paid by what's done and by results.
Absolutely.
So if we're trying to identify what is it that nurses are doing that is actually, that we can add it into the quality criteria, for example. So that's my quick version of the question.
Right. Yeah. And Chrissy?
I wanted to ask how much it's possible for nurses to have really good supervision, because social workers have supervision to manage all of those feelings and things that are coming up when they're dealing with difficult things. And as you say, there isn't the money for courses, but I wonder how easy it is to organise a really good supervision, not just in terms of have I done the right practice, but what's actually happening to me in the process and how am I dealing with that.
Yes. Well, they're two quite different questions, really, but I'll have a go. To answer the first one, I have a problem with evidence-based practice, I'm afraid. I'm a bit of a rebel. I don't believe that everything nurses do can be evidenced. I think if we only did what we had empirical research evidence for, we wouldn't get up in the morning. And the kind of things that nurses do, which are about how they communicate and how they touch, nobody's ever going to fund that kind of research on the kind of scale that's ever going to be convincing. So I think that to some extent we are working within a market that is stacked against us when we're trying to prove benefit for these kind of things. However, I think that there are some ways of doing it. I mean, there is a whole movement now to do with looking at patient experience, which has come out of the quality agenda. So that's the idea of asking people about their experience is getting a bit more respect. And of course, the kind of research that goes along with that is qualitative research. And qualitative research is, again, getting a bit more respectable. So I would say that there are ways that we can show that patients value and want what we do. But I would also say that it's very sad if we've actually got to do research on it, because most of us know that we like it when people are kind to us and we feel better and we're likely to do better. To answer the question about supervision, we haven't done very well in nursing with supervision. There's much better systems in midwifery and in mental health nursing. In general nursing, we haven't done very well. I'm not sure that supervision... I suppose I would be more interested in group supervision as a way of dealing with this. And again, it goes back to the idea of having inspiring leaders, and that is exactly the kind of system that a good leader could set up amongst their team. I think we have a drastic shortage of inspiring and inspired leaders in nursing, and I think that's the root of a lot of our problems.
Well, not really, but you know, I'm flexible, but everyone else has to be too.
Hi.
Yes.
My name is Natália. This isn't actually a question, it's just to share an experience of mine. This is my second time here in BK, so I'm just knowing London also. I'm from Portugal and I'm an architect, and actually I did some missionary work for Christians in Angola, and at that time we were working in lots of fields, but the last thing that we used to do before going home is going to the hospital. At the hospital there was only one nun that was the medical staff and one nurse, and the hospital was packed. What we used to do is go there and just give assistance, happiness, touch. And what actually happened was, in my behalf, I actually taught some African people and children to hug. They didn't know what was a hug. And years have passed already, but I'm still in touch with them, especially the sisters and the children that were expected to die, and we taught how to hug. We used to actually lay down on their beds that were covered in wee, and we used to play with them there. I know you shouldn't do that, but I actually got all wet. Those children that we dedicated ourselves actually are now living. They survived it. So we gave them spiritual strength.
Yes.
And before we went there, they trained us in Portugal in a mental hospital institution. and we normally they just accept people that are spiritually developed, so they can help the mental patients and help them just speaking with them or touching them or just by hearing. And that actually helps a lot and helps us be stronger to do the work.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. I think that's a really good example of spiritual care through the body, reaching all those parts to people. And it also touches on another subject, which is that the model that we tend to teach these days, which is so based on having conversations, doesn't work for whole groups of people, such as those members of our community that have dementia, those children that are learning disabled, and we have to find other ways to reach out to them, although those ways are actually ways to reach out to everybody. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much, Janice. I don't know how much the audience realises. In a way, you're really giving us a call to come back to sort of common sense, really.
Yes.
And what we know to be true, that what's important is that people feel that you're connecting with them, that, as you say, you're giving them love, that you're listening, that there's humour, that there are really basic qualities and attributes that everyone can access if they're encouraged to do so. I remember Paul Gilbert saying, really, it's not that you teach people to be compassionate, that's innate in human nature, but you have to create the conditions in which that can arise. And I feel that's what we're struggling with in the health service today, is to create those kind of conditions.
Yes.
So I'm left with, just thinking everything you've said and some of the issues you've raised. What's the difference between person-centred care and spiritual care? What makes a human human? How does it feel to be cared for? And really, I think a lot of us are thinking now, where did we go wrong and how can we put it right? Big project, but I think your book and your ideas are a real contribution to this current dilemma. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, okay. So while we're just reorganising, so Janice will leave the stage, and we're very lucky to have Anne come back and serenade us again. So if those thoughts of being sick or needing spiritual care are with you, music is a very good medium to touch the soul. So thank you, Anne, for sharing your gift with us again.
This is a North American song, gospel song, and it's called Blessed. And I'm feeling that it sort of reflects what we've been listening to on a heart level. Blessed always, blessed always, for the arms of God surround us. Let our joy be so triumphant that we rest in God as we say, Amen. Blessed always, blessed always, for the arms of God surround us. And let our joy be so triumphant as we rest in God and we say, Amen. As we rest Let our joy be so triumphant, 'cause we rest in God and we sing Amen.
Thank you very much, Anne. I'd now like to invite Sister Genti to come up on the stage. Sister Genti is the European Director of the Brahma Kumaris, but was also originally a trustee of the Janki Foundation, has had a long-standing interest in matters to do with healthcare. So I'm very interested, Genti, to see what your reflections are on what you've heard this evening and any insights you'd like to share with us. Thank you.
Good evening and a greeting of peace. Om Shanti. Thank you, Sarah, and especially thank you, Janice. I think I would agree with practically everything you've said. So I think that our ideas actually come together very, very closely. And of course, those of you who know Dadi Janki must have been remembering her a great deal. Why? Because of two things in particular. You know that she was a nurse for the organization for a gathering of around 300 people alone, the solo nurse, or solo medical staff, for around 11 years of the first 14 years of the period of establishment. But secondly, also because whatever Dadi does, she does with such great love and care. Whether she's walking down the corridor, and you never know how long it's going to take her to walk down a corridor, because she's going to stop and pause and smile and have a kind word for everyone she meets. When she tells us, I'm going to come down to reception through the dining room, some of you know the geography of the house, so that's going to take her half an hour, because she's going to stop and acknowledge every person in the dining room. And sometimes there might be 60, 80 people there. So to do everything, practical, physical things, and not just giving speeches and talks and lectures, but whatever it is she will do with a lot of love and a lot of kindness. And I think this was essentially the message that I was taking from what you shared today. A couple of things I'd like to say. Spirituality and the definition that I would offer for that. Spirituality is the study of the things that make up the human being that are invisible. And so I, as the human being, there's the visible parts, and then there's the non-physical, spiritual parts. My thoughts, my feelings, my memories, my experiences, my personality, and so on. So all of that make up the spiritual dimension. And so to be able to know myself, to be able to spend time in silence and reflection, is to be able to discover all of these inner aspects which I know are there and I know are real, but to find out more about them through my own inner journey and my own work inside. And as I do this, I discover the spiritual relationship that I have with everybody around me. Because there is a bond that links us together as a human family. And nursing is one aspect, but really we've forgotten about spirituality in our daily encounters and interactions with each other on all levels. And so it's so important to come back firstly to the awareness of my own essential spiritual nature, because human being, the human, the physical form, but the being, the inner being, the spirit that I am. So to get in touch with that, and then on the basis of that, to connect with others through that. Janice spoke about eye contact, and we talk about the eyes being the windows of the soul. And so whatever it is I'm experiencing internally within the soul, it's expressed through the eyes, and it reaches the other through the eyes. And so when I see you with that awareness of spirituality, and there's a spiritual encounter, it doesn't happen through words. It may do, but that's secondary. But it happens through firstly my awareness of who I am, and secondly seeing you in the awareness of who you are. And of course, if you respond in the same way, there's a very, very beautiful exchange that happens. And we have a word that we use here for that. We call it drishti, the encounter that happens in silence through the meeting of the eyes. And so yes, definitely, maybe the first impact of spirituality is the way in which I look at you, the vision that I hold of you, and my awareness, of course, will determine the quality of that vision and how I relate to you. But definitely, at a time when a person is very vulnerable, then your vibrations impact them. The attitude with which you enter a room and the feelings that you have reach them far more quickly than if they were active and busy and in another world. You know how when somebody is well and strong, then they're getting about things and doing whatever it is they need to do. And so they've created this space around them which is a busy, busy, busy energy. And it takes time to penetrate that. But when a person is not well, they're in a very reflective space, maybe distressed state, but yet still within that distress there's also a different space that they're in which there's no busyness as such. And so they're very, very receptive to the vibrations that you're putting out. And so whether it's a nurse or whether it's a visitor, they respond to the vibrations that you enter their space with. And definitely your eyes will tell a story, but your vibrations, your attitude and your awareness will reach them very, very quickly. And so the spiritual consciousness or the spiritual awareness with which we do anything, everything, makes a big difference to the outcome, the results. And so I'm not talking about results that can be quantified, but results in terms of the human experience that another individual has through your encounter with them. And so spirituality impacts everything in life, but especially it impacts in a situation when there's care being extended to another. We would see two things working together, soul and body. And yes, definitely, the impact of soul on the body is huge. If I keep my mind light and easy and positive, this body of mine will cooperate and I'll be able to work for several more hours than I could otherwise. That's the reality. And if my mind is a bit heavy because I'm having a lot of waste thoughts about this thing, that thing, and the other thing, then I'll do a little bit of work and I'll get exhausted. It's part of our experience. And so the way the mind is, the way the soul is, and we would see mind as part of the soul, not getting into any technical definitions now, but just that what I'm thinking, what I'm feeling, all of this is impacting the way my body functions. And yes, of course, whatever my body experiences, that's going to reach the soul. And so there's a constant interaction and flow of energy from the spirit to the body, to the physical, and from the physical to the spirit. And so it's ongoing all the time. And in fact, what we try and do is help people who are in physical pain, is to say, try experiencing the detachment of soul and body. Yes, the soul is in this body, and this body is going through whatever experience is maybe uncomfortable, but try and focus your energy here, just in the awareness of the soul. And when they practice this, when they do this, they feel that the capacity of the body to tolerate and to have resilience is a lot greater than otherwise. And so both things working together continually. And so yes, when a nurse approaches a person, then not only their vibrations, but definitely the care and love with which they touch the patient, that has a terrific impact. And there's a spirit of selflessness that one recognizes in a nurse, in that they're caring for a person in a way that nobody else cares for them. And so if a nurse carries this feeling of care, which is in itself a spiritual quality, then that is a very beautiful experience that the patient is able to have and feel the benefit of that. We use the word a great deal here, which is a combination actually of two words. It's the term karma yoga. Karma, action, and yoga, the state of meditation, the state of union or connection with the divine. And this term, these two words being put together, maybe describe nursing in its excellence, in that the consciousness is of the highest order, the consciousness is that of selfless giving, and maybe even if a nurse is aware of some spiritual higher being, maybe they are, maybe they're not, but if they are, then if they're aware of that connection, and then they put this through into their actions, then that love and that purity and that peace is transmitted through the actions that they perform. But also it then ensures that the nurse isn't using just her or his own energy, but it's an energy that's come from above, and they're using that energy and it's reaching the other in a very special way. So I would suggest that compassionate nursing actually is karma yoga. It's yoga in action, yoga being expressed through the quality of care that is being shared. There was mention a little while earlier of being able to sustain the nurses. And we've often had programs in Oxford at our retreat place there, which have been described as caring for the carers. And this has sometimes been for doctors, sometimes it's been for social workers. I don't think we've actually had a program focused especially for nurses, and I think we should. but one of the most important things that comes across in that is that the way to be able to sustain the self is by having some type of daily practice. And whatever sustenance anybody else can organize for you will always be available sometimes. It can never be available all the time for whenever it is you need it. But if I can learn a method of being able to sustain myself, and what we usually recommend is time for the self first thing in the morning. And I know that nurses have very difficult shifts to work in, but the night hours, the early morning hours, are very, very quiet time. Maybe not on the wards, but maybe in between other things. But to make time each day, to have time for nurturing the self and sustaining the self by periods of silence, not empty space silence, but silence in which there's something creative, something positive, something elevated and powerful that's going on within the consciousness. And the training we give is in meditation, Raj Yoga meditation. And secondly, by feeding the mind something powerful and stimulating and elevating. And so and it applies to all of us, because everyone in any situation today has a lot of stress to deal with, but especially for nurses, if we make time for silence and we make time to fill our minds with something that's going to nourish the mind, then that gives a lot of strength. And so the soul is able to deal with things that come our way much better equipped to be able to face whatever it is life is going to bring, whether in terms of work or in terms of our personal situations or just the state of the world and the way things are today. So, a few things to really think about. Soul making the body function, but body responding also to the awareness of the soul. And then to try this practice of karma yoga. Yoga, a higher awareness, a higher consciousness, expressed through action, expressed through all the things that we do in our lives. So thank you for sharing your thoughts. It was very powerful and very beautiful. Let's try a few minutes of reflection again. Sitting quietly, reflecting on what are the intrinsic qualities of the being that I am. As I journey within myself and I think about what is it that is at the core of my being? What is it that I carry within myself? I realize that peace is at the heart of the being. And I know that when I have thoughts that are peaceful, and I feel peaceful within, the vibrations I emit are also of peace. The work that I do carries that feeling of peace. the encounters that I have share the peace that I feel. And I know that as I connect deeply with myself, I can nurture this peace and I can allow it to grow. And in this awareness of the peace within, I know that within myself there is truth and there is love. I forget this sometimes when I just get caught up in the things of the world outside. But giving myself time to reflect, time to be with myself, I know that this is who I am. In my original, natural state, there is love and there is truth. I also know that that is the reality for every other human being. Within the core of that being are these same qualities of peace, of love, of truth. And I decide that this is how I will connect with each person I meet. I will connect with that inner being so that those same qualities are being shared and made visible. Thoughts of love reach out, and the responses of love an attitude of truth stimulates a response of truth. I know that this is the way forward for myself and also a little step towards creating a better world. Holding this awareness, come back to the physical dimension, but I keep these thoughts and these feelings with me. Om Shanti.
So it just is up to me to thank everyone. I'm sure you'll all agree it's been a very thoughtful evening, hasn't it? I mean, they're not easy things to talk about. I was reminded of Penny Campling's book. She talks about intelligent kindness and how really the work of healthcare professionals is not easy work. It's dealing with, you know, as you were saying, the bits that come out of human bodies and the death, the dying, very difficult feelings. And so I think tonight we've been really taken on a journey to think of how we respond to those kind of needs and how to do it in an authentic and compassionate way from our hearts as nurses or healthcare professionals generally. But it is a thoughtful subject, and thank you, Janice, very much for the deep thinking and the intelligence that you bring to the topic, and doing a whole thesis on it. I think it's to be commended. And all the helpers here tonight, of course, all the ushers, the people who help with the AGM, the people who put together the program and sent it out, especially to Bhavna Bhatani, the Honorary Secretary. She's done an enormous amount of work, and Tina and Viraj, all the girls in the office, all the people here who've helped make it happen, and the Brahma Kumaris for allowing us to use the premises. At the back of the hall you'll notice there is an exhibition on the Janki Foundation work, so if you're interested, do have a look at that. And also Janice and Anne Malone will be at the back with their books and CDs. And anyone who's working in nursing or healthcare profession, I'd really recommend you get a copy if you can, because you'll find it very helpful.